Okay, we're just about to 7 o'clock here. Let me start. If anybody else comes, we can catch them up. But the couple things I wanted to just pass on, suggestions to try to keep the meeting moving along. First of all, if we've got a presenter and not much conversation going on, it probably would be good if we put our microphones on mute, which I see most of you already have, which is great, to avoid the extraneous noises, distractions. Also, hopefully this won't have to happen, but if too many people want to speak at the same time, then we'd like to use that raise hand feature on the bottom of your participant list. And John or I will try to keep track of the list and who's got the hand raised. Otherwise, I think if that get too confusing, we can just talk whenever there's a break. Already mentioned that all three of our alternates will be voting members this evening because we have actually 4 absences. And also the meeting will be recorded, as the live meetings in township office are as well. So just remember that. If we have anybody join, we'll have to ask them for their names and addresses for the record. And lastly, I'd say just bear with me. This is my first Zoom meeting. I've had a couple chats with people, but this is the first Zoom meeting, so appreciate you bearing with me. When we look at the agenda, the first item was the call to order, which I will do now, but since I'm not sure, other than Mr. Lefevre, if anybody has flags in their room, we're going to pass over the pledge to the flag. So the first item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes from the March 11th meeting.
Mr. Fullerton, just so I have it, you are officially calling the meeting to order?
Yes.
Okay. Just so everybody is aware, the Zoom meeting is being recorded.
Okay, we have a number of people that were at that March meeting here, so I'd ask that you folks review them, or maybe you've already reviewed them and you could come up with a motion.
No, that's not visible.
Are you looking for a motion now, Jim?
Yep, yeah.
All right, I'll make a motion to approve the minutes of the May 11th, 2020 as written.
I'll second that.
I wasn't watching. Was that Brent or was it Dan?
It was Brent.
Brent. Okay, we have a motion by Mr. Hackett, seconded by Mr. Detter, that we approve the minutes of the March 11th meeting as submitted. All those in favor signify by saying aye. And that's one other thing I forgot to mention. As we go through taking votes, we're going to do a roll call, so there's no confusion about who's voting aye and nay. So I guess we'll just work through it. Mr. Hackett?
Aye.
Mr. Detter?
Aye.
Mr. Caldas? Was that a yes? Aye. Dan was yes?
Aye.
Aye. Okay. And Mr. Will?
Mrs. Will?
Mrs. Will?
Mrs. Will, how do you vote?
I don't see her on the list anymore.
We can't hear you right now for whatever reason.
Oh, I see.
He is saying aye.
Julie's saying aye. I don't have her on the view right now.
I did see a head shake to the positive, so she is affirmative for an aye.
Okay. Mr. Geringer, you were not there at that time, right? You weren't even an alternate at that time, and I will abstain because I was not there. So as I have it, that would be four
Um,
ayes and 2 abstentions.
And
Mr.
Mr.
Chairman,
Biggs?
Brian Biggs is here, and I vote aye.
So we
Oh,
have,
hi, Brian.
so that's a 5 in favor and 2 abstentions, correct?
Yes. 502. Okay, the first action item is the Dutch Valley Auto Works sketch plan and a request for waiver of preliminary plans. I think a couple of us can remember back to when this came around, but it might be new for about the other half of us. So, do we have somebody here from Dutch Valley to present?
Yeah, Brent Good with the LA Group, and I
Mhm.
believe, hi, everybody. Thanks for having us. Jeff McCollum, the owner of Dutch Valley, is also on the call. This is may be familiar with it, a business auto repair business that's been here for quite some time, located at 331 Columbia Avenue at the corner of Richardson Drive. Right now, it's about just over 3 acres. The zoning is appropriate for the use. It has a residential house where Jeff resides, right at the corner of Richardson Drive in the lower southeast or southwest corner. And then the main part of the commercial business is more on the eastern side with the larger building in the back. The purpose of this plan, and right now it's 2 lots, smaller lot. The lot line pretty much goes right down the middle of the site. The residential lot is the same zoning, but is on that western side, and then the auto business is on the eastern side again. What we had, Mr. McCullough had a plan submitted as a small project stormwater plan back in 2017 as prepared by Ritu. And that plan was approved. And at that time, he did some improvements with an infiltration trench, stormwater trench, and then expanded it during construction. He proposed then during that time, shortly after, to build a 45 by 45 garage. And the infiltration trench was expanded to accompany that. And as you can see on the screen now, this is the proposed plan. It shows that the gray area is that proposed 45 by 45 garage with a little bit of paving there. My understanding was that the infiltration trench to the north of that area was expanded at that time to accommodate that additional impervious area. This particular plan, our mission now is to subdivide, or let me go back and say, it became apparent that Mr. McCullum wanted to use the garage for commercial purposes, and so his building permit was denied because it was on a residential lot, or on the lot the same with the residents. So in order to make it acceptable to be used as a commercial use, we're looking to subdivide off the residential house to a smaller lot that's still compliant with zoning in terms of setbacks and size, but then the remaining would be added on to the eastern side to be a larger lot, 1. And so it's a relatively simple plan. And so we're before you tonight with this sketch plan to gain a preliminary plan modification. Because of the simplicity of the plan, we'd like to get that modification so that we can just go into submitting the final plan. And like I said, the preliminary plan process is our modification we're looking to obtain in terms of the modification. And again, it would eliminate the redundant reviews, fees, and processing time because believe that this plan is pretty straightforward and are justified to request that modification. I'd like to open it up to the board for any questions or concerns.
Brent, this is Brent Good, that is. This is essentially the same plan that we looked at before, except the lot lines changed.
That'd be correct. If you can see the house in the lower southeast or southwest, sorry, I get my directions here mixed up. You can see a line has been struck there as proposed exactly. And that, I also have that. That's proposed to be 0.39 acres, which, as I understand, is compliant with the zoning. And then the remaining acreage is the lot 1 for the main commercial area would be 2.867 acres.
Any commissioners have any comments or questions?
Just to clarify, the zoning is the Community Business Center, CBC zoning.
For both properties or the whole entire parcel?
That is correct.
Okay, if there's no further questions or comments, I'd be ready for a motion regarding the waiver of preliminary plan for Dutch Valley Auto Works.
Mr. Chairman, I'll make the motion to recommend approval of the preliminary plan waiver for Dutch Valley Auto Works project.
I'll second.
Is that Jim?
Jim Hackett, yes.
Okay, through the, for voting then, Mr. Biggs,
Aye.
Mr. Hackett,
Aye.
Mr. Detter,
Aye.
Mr. Collis,
Aye.
Mrs. Will,
Aye.
Mr. Garrender,
Aye.
and I will vote aye. So the motion is unanimous, 7-0.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brent.
May I ask, will this now be going before the supervisors at their next meeting?
Yes, it will be.
And then we'll be looking for them to take action on the modification. And if that is positive and we gain that, then we'll be submitting a final plan to proceed for that approval. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Thank you for all your time.
Thanks, Brent. Have a good night.
You too. Thank you.
Okay, the remainder of the meeting has to do with actually 3 modifications to the ordinances, various ordinances. The first one is a clarification of the retaining wall versus fences. And I believe that is impacted by looking at small modifications to 2 ordinances. So who would like to take us through that, John or
Yeah,
Scott?
thank you, Mr. Chairman. The first item on the screen that you'll see, we did get the comments. These are the draft comments from the county. The county did have their meeting on Monday. The County Planning Commission did vote to recommend approval of the ordinance as it was presented. And to refresh everybody's memory from back in March, it is a minor change to the ordinance, but it does provide clarification. The section that is underlined, and I'll read, shall not apply to retaining walls, simply clarifies that this section of the ordinance deals with regulations involving fences and decorative walls and shall not apply to retaining walls. So Adding that section will alleviate some of the issues we've had with commercial and residential development, new and infill and additions to properties that have had to go before the zoning hearing board to get relief of this section of the zoning ordinance. And with that, I will leave it to you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, so when I look at those couple of pages, there's really only two things we're talking about. One is the definition of a retaining wall, that short sentence or two. And then under the section 5.2 is the part you just underlined or mentioned was underlined. Is the rest existing?
That is correct.
Okay. So those are just the relatively minor changes.
Yes, sir. The definition is there to clarify what we mean by a retaining wall.
Okay. Does anybody have any questions? If not, then I would be ready to entertain a motion on recommendation for these ordinance amendments.
I do have a question.
Okay.
Under number 3 of 275.2 AA. Okay, so in the location because of the clear site triangle, so is that also understood that also retaining walls are not allowed to be in clear site triangles? Is that clear too?
This whole section, number AA2, anything that is dealing with the retaining wall is exempt from this section of the ordinance. So it has nothing, retaining walls would be allowed to go in the clear site triangle.
So just pick up on that a little bit, John. If we're still using the word wall under the fences, tell me what kind of walls they would have that aren't retaining walls.
A decorative wall, basically serving the purpose of delineating property lines or there to delineate the areas between maybe a garden or a lawn, something that is not a necessity for grading or structurally.
Right.
Okay. Okay, further discussion on that point, clarification on Dan's question? Is everybody hearing me okay?
I have no, I have no further comments or questions.
Okay, then once again, I'll ask if anybody would like to forward a motion regarding this ordinance.
I'll move to approve the ordinance.
Who was that? Sorry. Dennis, is that Dennis?
We finally got it sound to work.
Okay. Just as a modification or a clarification on that, Dennis, we recommend that the supervisors approve it. We don't vote to approve it, but
Okay,
take it.
and I move to recommend to the supervisors they adopt the amendment.
Okay.
I'll second that.
Right. Okay, we have a motion by Mr. Garinger, seconded by Mr. Jeter. We recommend approval of the changes to the ordinances regarding retaining walls and fences for the submission this evening. Am I breaking up to everybody or an echo?
There is some feedback. I don't know if it's coming from you, Mr. Fullerton, or somebody else, but in order to to try and figure it out, if I could ask everybody to mute if they're not talking.
Well, I think that's my,
Dennis is in twice, which is the reason why you hear him.
Okay.
Oh, he's on
It's
the
com-
phone. He's on the
it's coming
phone.
from,
Okay. Thanks, Cindy. Okay, so we have a motion, once again by Mr. Geringer, seconded by Mr. Detter, that we recommend approval of the modifications to the retaining wall and fence ordinances per the submission this evening. All those in favor? No, not all those in favor. Let's go down the list. Mr. Biggs,
Aye.
Mr. Hackett,
Aye.
Mr. Detter,
Aye.
Mr. Caldis,
Aye.
Mrs. Will,
Aye.
Mr. Geringer,
Aye.
and I will vote aye. So the motion carries 7-0 to send the modifications on to the supervisors. Okay, the next ordinance we're here to talk about is the village residential zone. And I think at this point I will defer to either Scott or Nick or John to run us through that process and why we're here.
Sure. Take over if you don't mind, John. I'll just run through it real briefly here. So basically, these ordinance changes were in response to some change in character that the township staff and officials were coming across through their daily work and through maybe some of the permit applications and other things that came through the township. So we worked with John and staff to come up with kind of a joint effort here to address those issues and then also clean up a few pieces to agree with some of the other changes that happen in the ordinance as well over time. So the version that is up on the screen is our draft version still that kind of has the changes in there shown in yellow. They're highlighted if you'll see them. And then there'll be a few spots in blue with a strike through, which means basically they're removed from what would become the new ordinance. So I'll walk through briefly. I won't touch on everything just to keep it brief, but if there's any questions, we can take them as we go or at the end, whatever works best. So we'll start off there, as John shows. The staff went through some of the uses that were existing in these two zones and decided that a few of those initially aren't appropriate anymore, and they were deemed to be removed. And you'll see that kind of duplicated in each of these areas. But basically there, you see the three uses that were pulled out, and specifically the communication antennas will be addressed with the ordinance that John's been working on. So that was just kind of pulled out to avoid any confusion or duplication as you walk through. If you scroll down a little bit, you'll see an ordinance, kind of an update or amendment there in yellow. We'll come back to the minimum lot area in a minute, but as you can see there, the square footage was changed, and then it was applied to kind of permitted residential uses only, and then it kind of addresses all the others throughout. But one of the keys to the ordinance change there is number 2. It'll state that not more than one principal residential use may be erected on one lot to eliminate some of the potential reuses of outbuildings and turning them into apartment style housing or multi-family dwellings that are being seen throughout. I think that was a key one that we worked with them to come through and kind of just make that pretty clear that the intent there is to limit the lot to one residential use. And then John, if you want to speak maybe a little bit as you scroll down, you'll see the density text was amended, or yeah, there it is through there. And if you want to speak briefly to the minimum lot area that you came up with that kind of addresses that density requirement.
Yep. Thank you, Nick. In looking at, and this applies to both the village center and village residential zone, that way I save everybody's time and we don't have to repeat ourselves.
Sure.
But the minimum lot area, 3,000 square feet, back when this ordinance was first introduced and worked on, 3,000 square feet may have been an appropriate size. But when we started looking at what the density is, 6 dwelling units per acre for a single family detached dwelling, 8 dwelling units per acre for a single-family semi-detached dwelling, 10 dwelling units per acre for a townhouse, and 10 dwelling units for a multifamily dwelling, would have equated to much higher than those listed dwelling unit densities. If you could imagine a 3,000 square foot lot, regardless whether we think it's appropriate to build one of those types of dwellings on a 3,000 square foot lot, we would have no ability under the current zoning ordinance to prevent somebody from putting a multi-unit apartment building on a 3,000 square foot lot if they so choose.
John, let me interrupt 1 second. How would that work? If you take 10 dwelling units per acre, I mean, the 3,000 square feet, the math doesn't work.
It doesn't. There's inconsistencies. The way you look at residential density, let's use multifamily dwellings. An acre is 43,560 square feet. So you can get 10 dwelling units based off of the current requirements on 43,560 square feet. If you narrow that down to 3,000, you're not getting 10. You might be getting 8 or 9 on a 3,000 square foot lot, but you're still getting 8 or 9 on a 3,000 square foot lot. So in looking at it,
That's what I don't understand, John, honestly. How does the math work? If you've got 3,000 square feet, you've got about what, 7 or 8% of an acre. So like 1/10 of an acre. So
you'd have to divide 43,560 by 3,000 to get the number of dwelling units they could put on there for a multifamily dwelling. And it's not 10 dwelling units.
oh, okay. You're saying, I'm sorry, I misunderstood. It's 3,000 per dwelling unit, not 3,000 per parcel. That's what I was thinking. It was 3,000 per parcel.
Correct.
Okay.
There is
Gotcha.
some issues with consistency throughout these two sections, and all told, the residential density, the way it's written, 3,000 square feet is the actual size of the lot. They could put any one of those types of dwellings on a 3,000 square foot lot. There's nothing that says somebody couldn't subdivide an acre into 3,000 square foot pieces and put a dwelling on that. I'll do the math real quick.
No, I follow you, John. I was thinking it was those 10 townhouses on one 3,000 square foot parcel.
So dividing an acre by 3,000 square feet, you get 14 and a half dwelling units per 3,000 square feet, which is much higher than any of the 4 listed density requirements. So looking at it, we see, and we're like, no, you can't put 10 dwelling units on a 3,000 square foot lot, but somebody could challenge and they would win. They could put up to 14 and a half dwelling units or 15 dwelling units on a 3,000 square foot lot. That was one of the things we were trying to avoid. If you take all of them together combined, the density is much higher than 15 dwelling units per acre. We're talking about between 30 and 50, which, if we want to retain the character of Rohrerstown and Landisville, one of the things we want to do is not increase the density that much. We want to retain the nature of the existing lots, but give them flexibility to develop it in a reasonable manner. That's why we came up with the minimum lot areas of 8,700 square feet. And 8,700 square feet comes out to 5.006 dwelling units per acre. We added the caveat that for all other permitted uses, half acre, we have to consider stormwater management now as part of any development. If a 3,000 square foot lot were to be maintained as the minimum lot area and somebody builds a house, even a reasonable or small house, there's nothing left over on that development to account for the stormwater created from the impervious areas due to the footprint of the house, the parking, any accessory structures like a shed or a deck or patio or anything else that normally goes along with these types of dwellings. 8,700 square feet and 8,700 square feet for a single family detached, a duplex, which is a semi-detached dwelling, or a townhouse. When we get to multifamily, it's 8,700 square feet per dwelling unit. So no matter how many apartments they're talking about building in one or multiple buildings, they have to have enough area to cover 8,700 square feet per each dwelling unit. That gives them enough area for stormwater management and for recreation areas for those apartments. 8,700 square feet would be enough area for, I'll use the example of a 1,500 square foot footprint for a building, for a house, whether that be a duplex or a townhouse or a detached, and to account for the driveway and a porch, patio, or any other impervious areas that would be needed or that the developer would want to put in to make them an attractive market. So I think I've bored you all enough. If there's any questions on that, I'll be happy to answer. And
John, I
yes,
have a question on. I'm looking at E1 and the title's minimum lot area.
mm-hmm.
And then on residential use, it has a minimum lot area, 8,700. And that could be interpreted to mean that you need 8,700 square foot per townhouse.
That is correct.
Per townhouse unit. So if you have a townhouse unit, unless my math is wrong, 25 foot wide, it'd have to be 348 feet long. I'm thinking that what you're dealing with is coming up with a lot of area. Several townhouses could go on. If I do a townhouse as fee simple lot, you really don't want that one townhouse to be that large of a lot.
Understood, Mr. Geringer, and we did look into that. We were looking at lot frontages and lot depths, and in an effort to leave flexibility in there, 8,700 square feet we thought was appropriate.
What about the middle unit of a townhouse building, where it goes wall to wall? Townhouses can be built for 18 to 25 foot wide. And then that individual lot would be the 348 minimum lot width. The town itself would have to be 35 foot wide.
Understood. And I think the way we viewed it and the way we were developing the ordinance and presenting it to the planning group, the planning commission, and to the board eventually, is this gives developers, property owners, enough area to either develop properties that are currently undeveloped or redevelop current existing properties. And I don't want to speak for anybody else, but in my experience, if a developer comes in and he wants to change the lot design, that's where the zoning hearing board comes in. And the purpose of our ordinance is to retain the character and the nature of the villages as they are. And
Does the village have depth of lots that long? And how do I own this middle unit of a townhouse building?
that's something that the developer would have to show us, and if it's warranted, they could get a variance.
John,
It's hard on us to take reasonable development design and allow it to take place. You know, I don't have a question with you controlling the density. But I think to come up with such an unreasonable lot for a townhouse is hard to justify.
I think when we looked at this ordinance with the staff, I mean, a big part of it, like John said, was controlling, like having some control over the character of these village areas, and trying to sort of maintain the type and nature of structures that are there now, and not allowing someone to come in and take a lot, tear down a house, and put 10 units on it, or even to put maybe multiple townhouse units on it. So I think the idea that it doesn't fit a middle townhouse unit maybe isn't exactly like that. That might fit what the direction was for the ordinance.
Now, my approach would have been to come up with the density of development that you'd like in the village, and then have greater flexibility to how wide the unit of a townhouse needs to be. And then not to burden a townhouse owner with a backyard that's as long as a football field.
I think part of that might come back to that maybe that townhouse doesn't fit in what the character and nature of the village is. If the lot needs to be distorted that much, then maybe it isn't an appropriate use.
Another way to achieve the same thing is, I mean, Dennis is right. Nobody's going to develop a townhouse in the village residential in this zone. It's just not practical at that point.
And what I was saying is that may be the point.
Right. Maybe you just, is it easier to just eliminate townhomes from that zone?
I think we thought about that too, and I think that it could create some non-conforming issues that there was some concern about at the beginning of the process.
I know there are a number of townhome style dwellings in Landisville and Rohrerstown right now that wouldn't meet that 87,500 square foot requirement per dwelling.
And Mr. Geringer and Mr. Detter, both valid points. I would also bring up that there are a lot of developments where they're coming in and instead of doing fee simple, they're doing condominiums. And in that, sense, if you look at the totality of the project, they could meet the requirements.
Yeah, but in zoning, we shouldn't be controlling the land ownership. No.
Also, in the maybe Nick or John, maybe you can answer this. I mean, how many lots are left in the VR or in this? Yeah, in the VR zone that could be developed that way. I mean, most of it's developed, unless somebody came through and scabbed together a bunch of parcels, added them all into a property and chopped them up differently. There's not too many more developable lots like that unless somebody was just doing redevelopment projects, correct?
Yeah, I think that's correct. We kind of mapped some of the available areas. Our focus and kind of the intent of it from the township was more looking at the multifamily dwelling unit housing than necessarily townhouses in particular. And we kind of ran those numbers, and I don't have a number off the top of my head of how many there are, but I know when we ran through, the intent was to limit the amount of properties where the multifamily dwelling units could be achieved. And I think with some of those, we did knock off a few kind of possibilities for townhomes, like you said, but I don't have an exact number for you, Brent.
Okay. I mean, I'm just thinking of Landisville. The biggest property that could possibly be developed is the Snavely property. Unless somebody on the north side of Harrisburg, Pike, over on A, B, C, D, and E Street or something, scabbed together a bunch of properties and wanted to redevelop something there. Okay.
I have a question. So would this affect, like hypothetically, someone, because I live really right outside of the Roystown area, and a lot of them are these like big old homes. And this might not even be permitted anyways, but if someone wanted to say like have a cute little Airbnb, which I think is kind of consistent with the character of Roystown and some of the cool like big Victorian homes that are here, is that like, would this prohibit that with?
No, in that sense, if there's I'll go off of the most bed and breakfasts, and is that what you're referring to, Mrs. Wells?
Yeah, something along those lines, and or maybe that's not a permitted use in the village.
Like the one on the corner of Elizabeth Street and Marietta.
I'm not sure exactly, but I think there's some in that area.
Yeah, in that sense, I'm just looking through the permitted uses, and bed and breakfast would require special exception. And regardless of the lot size or anything else, they still have to go to the zoning hearing board and show they meet the requirements to get approved for a bed and breakfast. But if the lot did not meet the lot size requirements, it would not preclude them from opening up a bed and breakfast on the property. It would be considered a non-conforming use. And they do have certain rights with non-conforming uses and non-conforming lots. A lot size that would not meet the current ordinance requirements would be a non-conforming lot.
Sure. And I guess another way of thinking about it is just because some of the homes in the Roystown area are massive, like if someone would want to put, maybe convert it to a multifamily, but more with the intent of having like an in-laws quarters, then would that classify that structure as 2 units? Or
that is a different, it's still a single family dwelling. An accessory dwelling unit is what we call an in-law quarters.
Okay.
That's the terminology our zoning ordinance uses. It is still a single family dwelling. It's just that's an accessory use afforded to that property to house another family member or somebody related to the property owners.
Okay.
John, maybe this would be a good time just to build on what Julie said there, in that if you get one of these big old houses that has a carriage house behind it or something, we don't want them to be able to take that carriage house and make a house out of it. So if there's 2 houses on the property.
We've already had that happen in Roystown.
But isn't that part of this ordinance to stop that?
You were exactly right, because that does detract from the nature and the character of the villages. If that were to happen to all the properties that had carriage homes in Landisville and Roystown, it could drastically change what we know of and what we view those 2 villages as. The one I'm specifically referring to, it had a large house that was probably sometime in the past converted to a 3-unit apartment building. In the back was a dilapidated garage. The owner rehabilitated it and basically rebuilt the garage, and then later came in and turned it into another rental unit. I had some disagreements with the zoning hearing board solicitor, and his pay grade is well above mine, and he viewed it as another use, a single family detached building. In that instance, we had a 3-unit apartment building and a single family dwelling on the same lot. And it's very difficult to come up with an appropriate dwelling unit density when you're considering that. Not only that, there were other things, parking, and if it wasn't for the fact that it was right next to a property that the property owner owned and had a shared parking agreement, it would have been very difficult to supply parking for all 4 of those dwellings. And if that were to happen in Rohrstown and Landisville, it could drastically change both those villages.
Okay, are we ready to go on down the list, Nick?
Well, I want to go to each. One principal residential use may be erected on a single lot. And I'm thinking that there isn't an issue if someone wanted to mix townhouses and multifamily dwelling, having the multifamily dwelling be a converted use of a historic structure, preserving the structure. I mean, why would they all have to be either all townhouses or multifamily?
Well, Mr. Geringer, I'm not quite following you. If we're talking about a redevelopment project where a current property is redeveloped it and there's a proposal for the two different types, I don't necessarily see where it wouldn't work. What the intent of this amendment is for issues like the existing homes with carriage houses on one deeded parcel, and that carriage house is turned into an apartment, or in an instance where you have a large single family detached dwelling that is converted into multiple units, and then to maximize their profit potential, the property owners or developers of that property convert the carriage house into another rental property. Those are the issues that we're talking about.
To me, if you use the property at the densities that the district permits, then you're not creating overdevelopment. You know, if only one sees the issue, we can move on.
I think the next piece to that, and we can just jump to that lot coverage. So the prior lot coverage, as you can see, was higher. With this one, it was reduced, and then there's kind of an extension there that allows for a maximum lot coverage of 70%, as long as there's some type of stormwater management that's been accounted for on the site, and also that the owner of the property enters into an operations and maintenance agreement for that improvement. It's assumed there may be some type of pervious pavement or something along those lines. So it's not as if they can achieve a higher lot coverage and then not maintain the area that they've dedicated for that that use as well. And this part of the ordinance then is all, again, it's pieces of this are existing. It was kind of reworked to allow the zoning officer to review and approve all the requests and all the materials that came through. So that kind of gives a little bit of opportunity for a person to be creative with the lot, but not exceed the number that was in place prior, but then also gives the township some review ability to work with them to create a design that achieves each party's goals.
Yeah. I have an issue with delegating to the zoning officer the ability to decide that the landscaping plan is adequate. The last sentence, 6A, has the zoning officer as the review and approval of landscape plans. I would think either some system that goes to a planning commission, governing body. And if it goes to a zoning officer, you should give him criteria. Like when he deals with lot width, you come up with a specific number.
I'm having a hard time, I don't know if everybody else is or not, I'm having a hard time hearing what that one gentleman was saying there. If somebody got that, either need to repeat it, or was the question addressed?
Nick, I think what Mr. Geringer is asking is if you take this paragraph, you're now taking the approval of a landscape plan and giving it to the zoning officer instead of some other body.
Oh, okay.
Is that what's the right thing to do?
Well,
I think, okay, yeah, go ahead, John.
our zoning officer is the assistant stormwater officer for the township. Colin is well-versed in matters of zoning, landscaping, and stormwater management. And in an effort to streamline the zoning ordinance and to limit the costs really to property owners to go to the zoning hearing board or to pay a professional to represent them, or the time they needed to come to the planning commission to get something like that reviewed, didn't seem appropriate.
Other than a single family house, these would be subdivision, land development plans that would go through the process.
But if it's not subdivision land development, Mr. Geringer, and a property owner wants to add more impervious area to their property, and they can offset that with pervious materials or some other stormwater feature, stormwater BMP, our staff is well equipped to review and approve those.
Right, John. No problem with that.
In
It's
most
the
instances,
land design. It requires you to impervious surface, but then it requires you to get some high level of landscaping. What is that?
and with the way it's worded, it provides greater flexibility for the proposals that would come into our office.
And then the only one who decides is the zoning officer.
John, I think too, a lot of times when you guys get these plans that you currently get for lots like this, don't you guys kind of consult with our office, with your internal staff, and then some? It's not just like Colin does that in a bubble, correct?
Absolutely. We get things, most of the time, we require stuff to be certified by a professional, whether that be a surveyor, landscape architect, or a civil engineer. In an instance where we don't feel comfortable reviewing it and approving it on our own, then yes, we do. We bring you guys in and get Scott's and your opinion from a professional standpoint on the proposed, whatever's being proposed.
John, I see this benefiting an individual lot owner, correct? I mean, I think that's the intent of this. If I own a lot and I want to put an addition onto my house and I'm exceeding the 50% lot coverage, this gives me an avenue of doing that without having to go through any sort of land development process. Colin can review my building permit plan and authorize an increase in impervious coverage. If a developer's coming in doing a large scale project, they're going to be going through a land development process, and that's going to be a different animal. So this more or less makes it easier for a property owner that just wants to put a small addition onto their house that exceeds the 50% maximum lot coverage, correct?
That is correct, and I think you eloquently helped me make that point. I wish I could have said it as well as you did, but that's exactly correct.
To me, the way this is written, it takes that judgment decision out of anybody else's or group's decision making and puts it in with the zoning officer. You know, if it was written so that in certain cases he's the only one, that's larger projects would go through a committee review. Again, if I'm the only one that sees the issue, I don't know what tonight.
And, you know, Dennis, I do see your point there. I mean, if I have a 10-acre property and I want to develop it in the VR zone, I can go to 70% with just Colin's approval. I don't have to do anything above and beyond that as long as I submit a landscape plan and a
note on the plan?
that he approves of. I get that. I mean, you have to read the ordinance verbatim, and that's exactly what it says. You are correct.
So Dennis, as an alternative, what would you suggest?
There's two approaches that work. One would be to allow a decision by the officer, but given criteria to make the decision, or to put the decision into a elected board. And, so maybe you write it so single family, one unit on a property, can go through zoning officer. And then our larger projects would go through a plan. I could think of some wording later. I didn't want to come up and submit wording changes for issues that only I see.
John?
Let's move on, Nick. I think we need to think about this a little bit before we pass over it. So let's go on and maybe come back to the subject.
Well, the good thing is, Mr. Fullerton, a lot of the changes are repetitive between the village residential and the village center zone. So we won't have to go through both ordinances in great detail tonight. And not only that, tonight, Nick and Scott and I are providing an introduction to the Planning Commission in the hopes that between this meeting and most likely the July meeting, the Planning Commission will have a time to really delve into the two amendments and have some good feedback for us at the June meeting or at the July meeting that we could potentially take back to the drawing board and incorporate those changes.
John, has this been submitted to LCPC yet?
I did submit it on Monday.
So theoretically, we make, I'm going to say, any significant change, it has to be reauthorized by the board and goes back to LCPC again?
That is correct.
Okay. Not that should stop us if it comes up, if it results in a better ordinance, but just to let everybody know.
Absolutely not. We did work with it. We worked on this with the planning group, and the board values the planning commission's input and appoints them to oversee matters like this. So if there are changes that the planning commission, and I greatly appreciate Mr. Geringer's comments, if there's any input or changes that the planning commission feel necessary, then that's the purpose of the planning commission reviewing these ordinances, because they have that ability, they have the expertise, and basically the board of supervisors is granting them that authority, or I should say you all the authority to review and recommend what you feel is appropriate.
Okay, Nick, you want to go on?
Sure. Yeah, with that said, and with the approach that we're
Let
going
me
through here.
one more thing. While we're on that page, there's a citation in E. It's a table under principle. It says, see a subsection E2, I think it should be E3. Hey. See subsection. It's on the top of the page.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Geringer, for pointing that out.
It's a problem of fresh set of eyes. not a young set.
Absolutely.
So I think in an effort to kind of just keep flowing, like we said, and have it be kind of an overall view of this than going through line by line. The other piece that was added throughout is, and John, if you want to maybe scroll here, just some type of amendments looking at right there, they're kind of wants to prevent a new lot from being solely fronting on an alley. That was added kind of at the request to keep some of these lots from being subdivided, to keep the character included. And then the biggest part at the end, it was included, if you want to scroll down to there when you get a chance, John, kind of to the demolition criteria for structures in these two zones. And this will be duplicated, as John said, in both. This one basically states that anybody who wants to demolition, like a storage shed or anything that's along those lines, that's kind of little consequence, that's not listed on the township's historical inventory, they can do so just like they would normally with a permit through Colin. But any other request to demolish a structure is now considered to have to go through a conditional use process with the board. And these areas that are outlined below kind of outline the criteria that would have to be met, in addition to obviously the ordinance requirements for conditional use. But these would kind of outline some what would need to be presented, some planning requirements that would need to be shown, and ultimately there's a piece in there that would address demolition by neglect, so that an individual may not be able to demolish a structure and then they would just let it fall apart. So it would, in essence, be demolished over time. There's pieces in there that would prevent that and then allow the zoning officer some form of enforcement that would, again, trigger back to the ordinance outline already. But that was kind of one of the concerns that was voiced pretty loudly in the beginning of all this, was kind of losing some of these structures, redevelopment of lots that may not be appropriate in the area. And then also people may be getting around some of the current criteria for demolishing structures. So this was put in to prevent that, and then ultimately give the power to the board to approve any demolition over 400 square feet, I believe it was, of a structure, and anything that we listed on the historical inventory as well.
Yeah, Nick, if you want to highlight the fact that we added in here demolition by neglect. And
Yeah, I think I was trying to explain that there. It would keep structures from just being ignored, if you will, or neglected. So ultimately, people maybe were, if they were denied the use or denied the demo permit, this part of the ordinance would prevent them or allow some enforcement by municipality to go back against that person and not allow the ultimate use that maybe they desire to come through by letting a property fall into neglect and deterioration, basically. And then it'll outline some areas there for Colin, or for him to move ahead with enforcement of that part of the ordinance specifically, and then also referencing the existing enforcement sections of the current zoning ordinance as well.
Couple of thoughts on this. The first sentence says structure shall be demolished, and structure is a defined term, and would exclude some small things, antennas, culverts, bridges. I'm wondering if we don't want to use a term other than structure, because you're probably thinking of building, but maybe not. Huh?
That's a great point, Mr. Geringer.
I think maybe, I'm not sure if anybody else is having a same issue or not, but maybe it'd be beneficial if anybody out there is able to hear comments, maybe if someone's keeping track, or there's a recommendation for changes in the end kind of thing, or things to come back to, that would be great. I'm having a hard time hearing that specific individual. So if that's available, that would be great.
Nick, I'm taking notes, and the
Right.
video is being recorded, so we can go back for if there's any questions or anything like that.
Perfect. Thank you.
I'll
Maybe.
try and figure out my mic later.
Guys, I'd like, when I read through this, I had a question on, I think it's E19. So I guess you'd scroll down from here, John. Talks about screening.
Did you say E19?
Echo 19, yeah, screening there. I just was thinking we might want to clarify a little more, be specific by when we say any adjoining lands within any of the residential zones. Could we, when I hear about screening, we usually
That's a good point too.
require screening between different zones, not between properties in the same zone. What were you guys intending here?
Well,
This is an existing part of the ordinance. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, I guess it is. It's not yellow,
Okay.
it's not blue.
Nick, I can, if you could just fill in where need be. Mr. Fullerton, perfect example of this. In Rohrerstown, half of it is split between Village Center and Village Residential. And then it also comes into play in certain sections where it's Village Center and the medium density residential zone. In that instance, we have actually had in the recent past a commercial property in the Village Center zone permitted. The property owner acquired the adjacent parcel and was expanding their business. Across the street, which was an alley, was the medium density residential zone. And in an effort to protect or to provide a visual screen, that section came into play. I absolutely see your point. And I think if we have the opportunity right now, I think we should take a look at the actual intent of the screening requirements, because it plays a huge impact and will play a huge impact on any future development in both Landisville and Rohrerstown.
Yeah, so John, I mean, you guys, or Nick, Scott, you guys didn't write this section apparently because it's a carryover, but I'm just wondering if we should be more specific about the intent, because if I have a residential property in that zone, I don't want to have to screen it against my neighbors. You know, they're in the same zone. Dennis, you're on mute.
Scott, Nick, I think one of the ways we can look at this and better implement a change is to clarify that we're really trying to screen commercial from non-commercial. And when it references Article 4 of the chapter, which is Chapter 270, it does list criteria for the different types of buffer and screens. But there again, maybe just taking this opportunity to clarify, we mean for commercial versus non-commercial, or whatever is listed or specifically reference something that goes back to Article 4's identified land uses and what they're supposed to be screening and buffering. And
well, you know, maybe this, I'm just thinking off the top of my head here, but if you go back to, you know, paragraph 2, I guess it is, or paragraph B, where it talks about permitted uses, you've got agricultural, residential, business, and civic social. So maybe you could say buffering between any uses on the residential, in that residential group. So that would cover you within the zone, not just an adjoining zone.
well, and to clarify, Mr. Fullerton, regardless if it's a use that is permitted in the zoning district or not, there are requirements that they have to screen for other land uses, residential, non-commercial, or non-residential in the same zone, as well as adjacent zones.
And that's this Article 4 that you were, Article 4 you're talking about?
That is correct. If I'll just bring it up in our ordinances to show you. And the other thing with this, I must highlight, the zoning ordinance requires it, but again, in order to provide greater flexibility, the design is left in the subdivision land development ordinance. So if there is an issue with some development or property that can't specifically meet the design requirements, then they can go to the Board of Supervisors and the Planning Commission to get a waiver of that requirement in the subdivision land development ordinance. So bringing up the adjacent land use requirements. So this is regardless, whatever the adjacent land use, whichever zone it falls in, these are the level, and A being the lowest level, C being the highest level of screening requirements for the uses on the left that they would have to provide. I lost my train of thought. I apologize.
That's okay. I understand what you're saying. So if a business use, well, no, not business, what do I pick? If an industrial comes in on a property, or no, back up, multifamily dwelling, there you go. So if multifamily dwelling comes in, they have to provide a B level of screening.
Yes.
Okay. Maybe it's just my not understanding that Article 4. Should have checked into that. Maybe we're covered.
Well, the duplication, and my reading of 19 would be if you were putting a new single-family house in the village and your neighbors were single-family homes, you'd be required for visual screening. And I think I use screening to soften the visual of a building which has a different bulk than the rest of the neighborhood. So you could have more detail to it. Or we just leave screening, go to the subdivision land development ordinance.
Yeah, to this Article 4.
We, Mr. Geringer, we do. We have the specific design requirements in the subdivision land development ordinance. And if I heard you correct, if it's a new residential use going in, they do not have to provide screening. That's why it's not listed in proposed use type. In
this draft ordinance. I have no problem with the subdivision land development ordinance.
I was just trying to clarify, Mr. Geringer, and it's difficult. Your audio is breaking up, so I didn't get all of that.
Okay.
But some of just to further explain, these proposed use types are more intense and are highlighted for a specific reason to provide that buffer and screening next to whatever adjacent use that may be. It doesn't necessarily have to be residential. It does get higher if it or the likelihood of an adjacent property or land use being residential. I'll just highlight if it's a proposed industrial use. If you see in the second column, if the adjacent property is in a mineral extraction or an enterprise zone, it's assumed that it's going to be something similar. Maybe not as intense, but it could be another industrial use or some other use that would be approved and appropriate in the mineral extraction or enterprise zone. In that instance, they would only have to provide for the lowest level of screening and buffering.
All right, so 1915 C4, Article 4, it should say if required by Article 4. Otherwise, this requiring screening for any adjoining lands.
Now, Mr. Garinger, what if the property in the adjoining residential zone is undeveloped?
And I'm putting a single family house in.
But
do you want me to screen?
If in the village residential zone, a residential property goes in the village center zone is next to a vacant RM zone property, there wouldn't be any screening required.
Well, the last part of the sentence says regardless of whether or not the residential zone property is developed.
And I think that's why it says see Article 4 this chapter. If you go of this chapter, if you go to Article 4, it doesn't list any requirements for a residential use to screen from adjacent residential uses.
Okay.
But I understand that point, and Scott, Nick, and I will certainly take a look to see if there's any way we can clarify that to make it easier to read and understand.
Yeah, sorry for putting this off there, but I just wasn't sure whether that should be capital residential zone or if you meant residential areas within the two zones we're talking about, the village commercial and village residential.
In this instance, residential is generic and not specific, so I don't believe it should be capitalized.
Okay, but then how do you, if we're in the village residential or village center, whichever, and go down or Marietta Pike there, and you've got a property, is somebody going to decide where the property beside it is a residential zone, as you have it worded?
That's what the zoning officer's his duty is.
But well, there's some properties in there that started out residential, they've been converted to businesses, and now somebody wants to do something beside them. Are we going to say you're next to a residential person or you're next to a commercial person? Because the use could change.
You're absolutely right. It's whatever the use is at the time of the development or the expansion of the existing use.
Okay, so then if somebody comes in and buys a commercial, this probably wouldn't happen, but buys a commercial property, converts it back to a single family residence, they're stuck with the commercial use beside them without screening.
Yes, and in that instance, if the residential use is permitted in that commercial zone and they're converting it to a residential property, they're the ones that are developing the property. The onus is on them. We're not requiring residential screening. The ordinance in this part is trying to provide some buffer and screening for the existing residential properties in the residential zones. So if you're willfully developing a property in the commercial district with a residential use, then some of that onus falls on you as the developer.
Okay.
John, why don't we jump to the village commercial, and then we can, there's not many, anything new that we didn't already go over in that one too. So we kind of got to the end of that one. In the commercial side there. Sorry if I was talking over somebody, I can't hear.
The demolition section. There's still a couple of items I want to point out.
Well, Mr. Garinger, it's the requirements for demolition is the same in the village center zone.
I'll wait.
Thank you. Nick, just tell me where you want me to go.
I would just scroll through. I mean, all this stuff right here is basically duplication from before. So we heard some comments on those. If you keep scrolling down, I think really the only thing that is different as we went through it is the max building size for the existing uses that we saw. So right there, you see the convenience store. I think we amended to agree with the amendment to the ordinance that happened last year, or maybe 2018, 2019. And then I think among staff and everybody, it was deemed that a grocery store of that size maybe wasn't appropriate for the village commercial zone with the character you were trying to achieve. So that was reduced. And we have the same language there about the new lots on the alley. And then as you scroll down, the only other changes that were proposed through here were just a slight wording amendment, which we saw in the VR zone that addressed the requirement to hook up to public utilities. And then there it is, technically feasible. I think that came from one of the planning committee members that they didn't necessarily want them to be not allowing anybody to create some type of on-lot utility. They wanted them to have the ability to do that, but they wanted someone to be able to show that they couldn't. So that was kind of worded that way in response to that. And then the parking requirements that would be tied to the commercial uses, we changed the text in there to agree with Article 8, which the township changed, I believe, last year as well. There's a little bit of conflict there. So that was updated to just reference and cooperate with that. And then we're back to the same demolition requirements we spoke about before. And I believe someone had a comment to go over there. So if we want to start with that one, I think we're back to that spot.
I think item F1, it requires, after you go over 400 square foot rather, that it is a conditional use. And I think that section should stop right when it says it needs a conditional use. What you're doing is adding conditional use, which doesn't show up as something best regulated once and consistently. For example, when I read the zoning ordinance under conditional use, there isn't a discussion of the planning commission. Now, it might be bad to do that, but if we're going to add an ordinance, conditional uses.
Dennis, you're really breaking up. At least I can only hear about 1 out of 3 words you're saying. So I'm not sure which, or you're using your phone or your computer, but it's really difficult to follow your train of thought here.
And Mr. Geringer, if I may, I believe I got the gist of what you were trying to say. I think he was getting to the point that, one, that section F, demolition, parentheses 1, where it says, it lists that it should be a conditional use. He's saying that it should stop there. And 2, that under the conditional use approved, or uses approved by conditional use, demolition should be listed as well. Mr. Geringer, please correct me if I did not get all of the intent, or if I didn't correctly interpret what you tried to say.
Correct. If it's a conditional use, just stop saying anything beyond saying it's a conditional use.
And if I understand why you're pointing that out, that's because of the conditional use criteria, which is established in another part of the ordinance.
Right, the zoning ordinance has provision for condition.
And if we're looking to add this, then we should look at a way of adding demolition for village zones as a new criteria listed under section 5.2.
Correct.
So it would be a special or conditional use requirements that are listed in that section, much like other land uses have additional criteria that are listed beyond the ones that are listed in each specific zone.
That's the way I would recommend it.
Scott, Nick, do you understand what Dennis is trying to get at?
I think I think I get where he's coming from. If you're taking notes on that one, maybe good to regroup on that one and try to see. Like I said before, I caught some of there and part there. I'm not sure if some of the text that was after it was asked to be removed or not. So if you have those kind of comments, we can definitely look over those.
Okay. I have another one, F3C. It requires certification from the owner. I don't know if certification is the right word.
I after you pointed that out, Mr. Geringer, certification is something that we should specify from a designated professional. The landowner could certify that it's not feasible for whatever economic reason, which is not necessarily the intent we're trying to get at.
Right. If it's not an opinion of the landowner, then it needs to be reworded. The other item is F3D. And my concern is that a request for demolition won't be until I send in a sketch plan. I can imagine cases where a building needs to be demolished and they don't have a development.
I had a question just kind of thinking through this with number 3C. So is this saying that landowners can only get rid of things that aren't functional? Like, for example, what if a landowner had a detached garage or a large, I don't know, sort of shed or something that they just didn't want? Is this prohibiting them from submitting a request to demolish that? Does that make sense?
Go ahead, Nick.
I was gonna say, I think if I follow the question, there's kind of a caveat or a kind of catch-all at the beginning there that would say that anybody that wants to demolish accessory structure less than 400 square feet, not listed on the historic inventory, it's just the normal process to go through that Colin would do now for a permit to demo. Does that address your question?
Sure. But what if it was larger than 400 square feet? I don't know, I could imagine there potentially being something we viewed a property in the past that had, I'm thinking of one that had a large barn type structure that was well over 400 square feet. But if I had purchased that property, I just wouldn't have wanted it to be there.
Mrs. Will, if I may,
Go ahead.
if I may, one of the reasons we distinguished 400 square feet and anything less is to make it consistent with our building code. Right now, anything that is under 400 square feet does not require a building permit and only requires a zoning permit. So the zoning officer would review it. And in keeping with that consistency, 400 square feet and over, regardless of what they want to do with it, it's going to require a building permit. So to be consistent, anything 400 square feet or over, not only is going to require a building permit, pardon me, but is then going to have to go through the process for approval from the board.
Sure. Yeah, I guess that wasn't my point. So the point is that the request requirements, so the, three here, request requirements, and then C is a certification from the landowner that the structure cannot be feasibly rehabilitated. Does that sort of,
And I think Mr. Garinger,
what if something could be rehabilitated, but they just didn't want it there?
and I think you're getting at the same point Mr. Garinger pointed out.
Okay.
A landowner may not necessarily be qualified to make that certification. And I think Mr. Garinger was getting to the point that we need to look at revising it to take it out of the landowner's purview and require like a certified or a qualified professional to make that certification.
Okay, I guess my point is saying.
I think Mrs. Will still has a point. She's saying if she bought the property and didn't want that barn behind it, she's not allowed to tear it down.
Not without going through the conditional use process.
And the conditional use process says she has to have a plan for its use afterwards, its space's use. So she could just develop a file for a conditional use and just show it removed and slot it in. And that would go to the supervisor.
That is correct. And I can't really, because it's with the conditional use, it's really up to the board whether they deem whatever submitted as appropriate.
Yeah, okay. But
the intent of this section is to try and protect the historic resources, like it says here within the village areas. So you can make that application. It'll be up to the board whether or not they feel it's appropriate to tear that down, or if it would be detrimental to the historic character of the village.
And John and Scott, the intent of this is the main intent of this is to stop somebody with deep pockets from buying 10 or 12 contiguous lots and tearing down all of the existing buildings and putting up something undesirable in this district, correct? I mean, that's the main focus of that.
Correct. It's just a lot of the control back to the Board of Supervisors.
Yeah.
With this conditional use process. We try to avoid the conditional use process generally because it is a little cumbersome, but in this case, it gives the board the discretion to say whether or not they agree with the demolition that's being proposed. It's not simply that somebody comes in with a permit to Colin has to give it to them because they're not, nothing that they're not complying with.
And Mrs. Will, for the steps we take, I should say, the steps we take for historic properties or properties that may be eligible to be added to either the county, the state, or the National Historic Register, those are protected. But in an instance, which I think you were trying to get at, it is if it has no historical value, other than it being the appropriate age, would a landowner be precluded from demolishing and removing or raising the building if solely because they want to? And I don't think they would be precluded. They just have to go through the additional steps and show to the Board of Supervisors the nature of the request, why they want to get rid of it, why they want to raise it, so on and so forth, and what they're doing with that area or with that structure, instead of keeping it as is and rehabilitating it as a historic or potentially historic structure. Mrs. Will, does that clarify, or does that help you with your question?
I think we lost Julie.
Yeah, she's gone.
Nick, was there anything else that you wanted to point out different than the residential?
No, I think that actually comes to the end there with the demolition criteria that was just mimicked in the VC from the VR.
Ideas. The next section, criteria for review, except three items identical to visual land development ordinance. And I wonder if it's wise for the same standards in multiple areas of the ordinance. And I'm thinking that much of pollution control could be a listing of demolition as a conditional use. And then hitting the land development standards. And if there's anything in addition you want to add, we can do that. This subdivision land development ordinance, I think, is the wisest spot to put the decision-making process, the supervisors approving a development plan. So we would demolition that's not associated with subdivision land or land development.
Hey, John, do you think it would be wise maybe to get just written comments from Mr. Garinger, so maybe we could capture them that way? Because I'm trying to do what you're doing too, and I'm missing, I think, some of the key points there. Would that be an okay ask?
I am going to follow up with Mr. Garinger to see if some of the things I could just get some clarification for that exact reason.
Okay.
Yeah,
Well,
I agree.
I can try to write something up for you. It's a lot easier when we're all sitting at the table.
Understood it. It would be a lot easier if we were all in person, but I would ask, I made a note here to ask Nick to provide his maps for the two zones to show the existing properties and how these changes to the zoning district design guidelines and requirements will affect the existing properties and future properties, showing how many properties will be non-conforming and what the adaptive reuse or redevelopment could be for certain properties. I don't know if it was Mr. Detter or Mr. Fullerton or Mr. Garinger who asked about that, but we do have that. It's and we will have that for the next meeting. Mr. Fullerton, and the rest of the planning commission, are there any other questions on the village center or village residential zone? The amendments?
Not for me. Let everybody else speak up if they've got something. I was just looking at the attendees list, John, and I don't see anybody that I don't recognize as far as public, being anybody from the public. So I don't think there's going to be any public input tonight.
Okay.
Is that you barking, Ed?
No, sir, that is not me barking, but I calculate that there should be 2 at-large attendees, 7 voters, 2 engineers, the manager, 2 supervisors, and that should leave 2 members at large. There was a Dr. E, I thought, made a comment. I don't know who that is.
I saw him earlier. He's not listed now.
Okay.
And we got Dennis signed in twice. I guess one on his phone and one on the computer or something.
That would.
That's how I got my sound to work. But my microphone, I'm still working on.
Okay. So is there any further comment, questions? I'd like to move on here with maybe a motion to table the discussion for the next meeting. But,
Well, this is not an action item. This is just an introduction. So there's really no need to
even table.
take action, but it might be beneficial since that's how we've handled similar items. Mr. Fulton, I'd like to point out Dr. E, who Mr. Lefevre referenced, did put in the chat. He had an unrelated question. Didn't go into any details. And Mr. Lefevre did ask, is the intent to limit the density to 5 dwelling units per acre? And
I believe if you do the math on 8,700 square feet, that's what you get.
that is correct. And that was our intent. I don't want to speak for Nick or Scott, but the feedback that we got from the planning group was the approach we took, and 5 dwelling units per acre is what we're showing you. That's basically the feedback that we got from the planning group.
I will be interested in seeing the comments from Lancaster County Planning Commission on that matter.
I'm pretty sure I could tell you what they're going to comment.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lefevre.
Going one more time. Anybody else have any input for this evening? If not, then I'd like to ask somebody to make a motion to table the review of the zoning ordinances for village residential and village center until the next meeting.
I'll move.
That was Dennis, I believe.
Yes, Dennis.
I'll second.
Right. Okay, motion by Mr. Garinger, seconded by Mr. Detter, that we table the review of the zoning ordinance amendments for village residential and village center until the next planning commission meeting. All those in favor signify by saying aye. No, forget that. Sorry. Mr. Biggs.
Aye.
Mr. Haggett.
Aye.
Mr. Detter.
Aye.
Mr. Caldis.
Aye.
Mrs. Will.
Aye.
Mr. Garinger.
Aye.
And I vote aye. So once again, it's unanimous, 7-0.
Mr. Chairman, if I appreciate all the input and feedback that we're getting on the village zone amendments. I simply ask that the planning commission members take a look if there's anything else that comes up remotely, whether you find it interesting, whether you find it confusing. Our intent here is to make it clear. Our intent is to protect the village zone's character. So please feel free to email me or call me if you have any questions or if something pops up. If not, then I just ask that write it down, jot it down, so we can discuss it at the next meeting that this will be on the agenda.
Okay, will do. The next item on the agenda was old business. I guess the question is, are we rescheduling the joint Board of Supervisor Planning Commission meeting, or is that still in limbo?
Let me see if Cindy is still, if I have not heard, I would ask Cindy if she could weigh in if she's heard any feedback from the board members about rescheduling this once we do get to in-person meetings.
I think there's still interest in that. We just need to get fully established in the in-person meetings, and we're really not sure when that'll be. I would anticipate maybe sometime in the fall.
Yeah, I think it's really important that we be face-to-face around it too.
Correct.
Okay, I don't think we have any public people here. I talked about that already. Is there anything else John, any new new plans or submissions or anything we'll be seeing in the future?
Not at this time, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. The ones out on Knoll Road that were on the initial agenda, are they waiting to do something or changing their mind, or what's happening there?
They are going through the conditional use process right now.
Okay. And John, once again, was that for both of the lots out there? Weren't there two contiguous that were in the same neighborhood?
Yes, their addresses are 701 and 791, and it's the two properties that are on the northeast corner of Knoll Road and Stony Battery. The 701 property had already gone through the conditional use process, but they have submitted a revised application. They're looking for approval from the board because of the criteria that they're going to have or anticipate having more than 50 large truck, tractor, trailer deliveries per day. And they're also seeking the new conditional use for the property that's directly at the corner, which is 791, for the same criteria.
I have something. In doing my research before attending a meeting, I tried to find on the website a list of the Planning Commission members. And I'm wondering if that's not something that deserves publication.
I can't say as I've ever looked, Dennis. You might have a good point.
And then the other thing, it would help me out greatly if I could get a paper copy of the zoning ordinance and the subdivision land development ordinance.
Absolutely, Mr. Geringer.
Yeah. In fact, Mrs. Will and Dan should also have it.
Yeah, at the last meeting, Mr. Fullerton, you weren't present. I actually handed out binders to all the planning commission members.
Okay.
And I will certainly get paper copies for Mr. Geringer, Mrs. Will, Mr. Caldas. And then that includes Mr. Geringer brought up the bylaws for the planning commission.
Right.
I believe I gave those to the members that were at the March meeting, but I will, if I did not, I will make sure that I have those for the next meeting as well.
I think you sent them out with email. And then to make it a little easier, I produced a document that puts side by side similar issues. But if the board's happy with their bylaws as written, I don't want to give people more work.
Be truthful, Dennis, it's never come up before that there's an issue with bylaws, so maybe I'll take a look at it again. You like you said, you did the side by side. I don't think anything jumped out.
Mr. Geringer, Mr. Geringer, if you want, I'll make a note to add that as an agenda item for the next meeting. And if you would be so kind as to send me the document that you prepared, I will send that out as part of the agenda packet for the next meeting.
Great, I can do that. The reason I sent that out was my research did not identify any bylaws. And I was trying to figure out how the Planning Commission works. There are different things in other people's bylaws. There's different items in the state planning board publication. It gives suggestions. Finally, I think I would ask that the bylaws also be something that's a public document and put it on the website.
Mr. Geringer, whatever you have done has corrected your audio. You're much clearer now.
The sun is set.
And the moon's up. So whatever, you've cleared up your audible.
I'll work on that also.
Okay, is there anything else to come before the commission this evening?
No, I just like to, on a final note, I thank everyone that is participating and attending this meeting for the patience that we're going through right now with C-19 pandemic and the fact that we are doing this meeting via Zoom. I do see this as a catalyst moving forward, gives us the opportunity, if we do get back to in-person. We now all have experience with Zoom, and I do foresee that continuing into the future. I know the board, I don't want to speak for Mr. Lefevre or Mr. Bennett, but I do know the board has directed staff prior to C-19 to look at ways of getting webcasts or something out there to the public to be more, to be clearer of what's going on and to show and to increase the participation with the public. I think Zoom is a perfect opportunity for that. I don't see it going away. It affords the staff the opportunity to record the meetings and then post them on the website. That way people that could not attend or chose not to attend can go back later and look at the video and offer comments at a later time, either via email or attending another meeting. But I'm working with Cindy and the rest of our staff at ways we're going to incorporate the Zoom aspect of our meetings once we do get back to in-person meetings. So don't be scared or alarmed if you do see webcams or something else in the board and the public meeting room. They're going to be there just to assist us in broadcasting the Zoom meeting for that time when we do get back to being face-to-face.
Okay, thanks for putting it together, John. I guess you're getting to be an expert at it, but we're all novices, or at least I am. So I appreciate your taking us through it. That being said, thanks everybody for spending the time with us, and the meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Scott and Nick, if you guys could hang out, I do have a few things to go over just for clarification's sake.
Yep. Thanks, John.
Thank you.
See you guys.
Good night, everyone.
Everybody stay safe and thank you.